In the warm glow of America's holiday season, no face became more synonymous with childhood wonder than that of a young Macaulay Culkin. With bright eyes and an effortless charm, he transformed Home Alone into a cultural landmark, the kind of film that stitched itself into the fabric of family tradition. To millions, he appeared to be the embodiment of innocence, playful, mischievous, and unmistakably genuine. His performance didn't just entertain, it reminded audiences of a simpler, more magical time, turning him into one of the most adored child stars the country had ever seen. Yet beneath that glow, hidden behind the laughter and the iconic one-liners, lay a far more complicated reality, one that the public, captivated by the character he played, never thought to question. While fans saw him as the luckiest boy in Hollywood, Macaulay's sudden rise was not a fairy tale unfolding, but a rapid acceleration into a world shaped by the ambitions of adults who recognized his marketability long before they acknowledged his humanity. The charm that captured the hearts of millions also unlocked a financial pipeline, funneling unprecedented profits through a child who was barely old enough to understand what success meant. And as the film's legacy grew, so did the machinery around him. Studio executives eager to replicate the phenomenon, media outlets obsessed with documenting his every move, and a father whose hunger for influence began eclipsing his role as a parent. Behind every poster, interview, and red carpet smile was a boy learning far too early that fame is rarely a gift. It is a transaction, and in Macaulay's case, that transaction came with a cost that would follow him long after the applause faded. Hollywood celebrated him as its golden child, but behind closed doors, he was becoming something else entirely. A highly profitable asset in a system designed to extract as much value as possible from the few years he remained young enough to sell innocence to the world. As America fell deeper in love with the face on their screens, the child behind that face slipped further out of sight. And it was in that widening gap between the myth they adored and the boy they never truly saw that the foundation of his eventual tragedy quietly began to form. Before Macaulay Culkin became the face of holiday nostalgia, America was already shifting toward a new era of entertainment, one defined by family-centered films, box office optimism, and the search for young talent capable of bridging generations. The late 1980s and early 1990s marked a moment when audiences craved stories that felt warm, relatable, and emotionally accessible, a stark contrast to the darker cinematic tones that dominated the earlier decade. Hollywood executives recognized an opportunity. If they could find a child who embodied innocence, humor, and authenticity, they could tap into a cultural longing that stretched far beyond any single film. Macaulay appeared at precisely the right moment. He carried an unpolished charm that felt real in a way that studio-trained performers rarely achieved. There was a rhythm to his expressions, a natural timing to his delivery, and a presence that made him instantly believable. Directors often remarked that he did not perform in the traditional sense, he simply existed on camera, and audiences connected to that sincerity without hesitation. In an industry that prized control and precision, Macaulay's effortless warmth became a powerful commodity. Home Alone magnified this effect far beyond expectation. No one predicted that a relatively modest family comedy would explode into one of the highest-grossing films of its time, reshaping the holiday movie landscape for generations. The film's success wasn't just commercial, it was emotional. Families returned to theaters multiple times. Parents saw pieces of their own childhood in his expressions, and children saw a version of themselves who was clever, resilient, and undeniably fun. Macaulay became a national symbol almost overnight, embodying an idealized version of childhood that Americans didn't just watch, they cherished. This sudden cultural embrace created a perfect storm. Hollywood wanted more films built around him. Advertisers wanted his face. Talk shows wanted his presence. The public wanted to believe they were witnessing a rare kind of magic, a child untouched by fame, yet capable of carrying it. But the industry's appetite had little to do with preserving that innocence, and everything to do with monetizing it. As the momentum grew, Macaulay was transformed from a promising young actor into a cornerstone of early 90s American pop culture, a figure whose every appearance translated into millions of dollars. And while the country celebrated him as the boy who made Christmas unforgettable, few realized how deeply this moment of cultural adoration would shape and ultimately distort the rest of his life. Long before Macaulay Culkin stepped onto a Hollywood set, his life unfolded inside a narrow New York City apartment where every corner felt shared, every sound carried, and every day revolved around making ends meet. As the third of 7 children in a family living on the edge of poverty, he grew up understanding scarcity long before he understood fame. His mother worked tirelessly to hold the household together, while his father, Kit Culkin, once a stage actor with modest recognition, carried ambitions that had long since exceeded the opportunities available to him. Beneath the surface of their unstable family dynamics lay an unspoken tension, Kit's unfulfilled aspirations lingering like a shadow, waiting for a new vessel. Macaulay's entry into acting did not begin as a dream he pursued, but as a possibility his father imposed, a path carved by someone eager to relive a success that had never materialized for himself. Early auditions became routine, a way to bring in money and, perhaps more importantly, to channel Kit's dormant hunger for relevance. What surprised everyone, including his own family, was how naturally Macaulay fit into the world of performance. He didn't act with forced enthusiasm or rehearsed technique. He carried an instinctive honesty that casting directors found irresistible. The simplicity of his expressions, the sincerity in his eyes, and the quiet resilience of a child accustomed to navigating chaos made him stand out in ways no one could have anticipated. But even as opportunities increased, the undercurrents at home grew heavier. Success altered the distribution of power within the household, subtly but unmistakably. Macaulay, still far too young to understand the implications, became the family's primary source of income, shifting the balance of authority toward a father whose expectations hardened with each paycheck. The more he earned, the more tightly Kit tightened his grip, framing every achievement not as a step forward for the child, but as justification for decisions he believed he alone had the right to control. Behind the emerging spotlight was a boy, living in circumstances where affection often intertwined with responsibility and where approval could feel conditional on performance. The stage that would one day broadcast him to the world was built on a childhood shaped by pressure, scarcity, and parental ambition, forces that would follow him long after the cameras began to roll. When Macaulay Culkin first walked onto the set of Home Alone, he was not yet the icon the world would come to recognize. He was simply a boy with a natural spark that seemed to light up every room he entered. Director Chris Columbus saw in him something extraordinary, a timing and emotional clarity far beyond his age. wrapped in an unrefined authenticity that could not be taught. What Hollywood considered rare, audiences would soon consider unforgettable. And when the film was released, its success surpassed even the most optimistic predictions, transforming a modest holiday comedy into a global phenomenon. The movie didn't just elevate Macaulay's career, it redefined the commercial possibilities of family entertainment. Studio executives watched in astonishment as Home Alone shattered box office records, anchoring itself as one of the highest-grossing live-action comedies of its time. But amid the celebration, what truly astonished them was the unmistakable realization that a single child performance had carried the entire film. Macaulay wasn't simply part of the movie, he was the movie. That fact alone turned him into Hollywood's most coveted asset, a young performer who could turn any project into a guaranteed success. Opportunities flooded in at a pace no adult, let alone a child, could comfortably process. He starred in film after film. My Girl, where he delivered a heartbreakingly sincere performance. The Good Son, showcasing a darker, more controlled intensity. Richie Rich, which attempted to capitalize on his star power even as the public's fascination reached a peak. The studio's expectations grew with each release, and the machinery surrounding his career expanded rapidly, weaving itself into his everyday life. Yet even at the height of his rise, subtle warning signs began to appear. Industry insiders noticed how negotiations for his roles grew increasingly tense, not because of the young star himself, but because of the presence behind him, his father, whose demands escalated as Macaulay's values soared. What Hollywood initially viewed as parental involvement soon evolved into a pattern of aggressive control, creating friction that many producers secretly feared would jeopardize their projects. To the public, Macaulay was the golden child of American cinema, a symbol of charm and innocence. But beneath that glow, the foundation was already shifting, revealing the early tremors of a collapse rooted not in the pressures of fame, but in the ambitions of those who sought to wield it. As Macaulay Culkin's fame intensified, the first fractures in his world emerged not as dramatic explosions, but as small, persistent shifts. Changes subtle enough to escape public notice, yet powerful enough to alter the course of his life. His schedule became a meticulously engineered cycle of filming, rehearsals, studio meetings, promotional tours, and tightly controlled public appearances. What looked like a dream opportunity from the outside slowly grew into a relentless machine, one designed to sustain the momentum of a child who had become too valuable to ever slow down. While his peers attended school, spent afternoons exploring friendships, or simply enjoyed the unstructured freedom of youth, Macaulay's days were dictated by call sheets, camera setups, and adults who evaluated his worth through profits rather than well-being. Each new film added weight to the expectations around him, and each successful release tightened the grip of those who believed his fame was not a blessing, but a resource to be harvested. The pressure did not fall evenly. It converged primarily through the figure who positioned himself at the center of Macaulay's life, his father, Kit Culkin. Industry insiders began noticing the tension long before the public did. Negotiations involving Macaulay became unusually combative, with Kit pushing for unprecedented control clauses, inflated salaries, and privileges that studios were reluctant to grant, even to established adult actors. Producers whispered about the volatility behind the scenes, the confrontations that erupted not from Macaulay himself, who remained quiet, observant, and compliant, but from a father whose demands escalated with every box office milestone. The same ambition that once propelled Macaulay into the spotlight now threatened to sabotage the stability of his career. At home, the pressure manifested in subtler, more emotional ways. As the family's livelihood increasingly depended on Macaulay's income, affection and responsibility blurred into one, creating an environment where the young actor felt both indispensable and trapped. The spotlight that brought him global adoration cast long shadows across his private world, leaving little room for vulnerability, confusion, or the natural missteps of childhood. His siblings felt the imbalance, his mother sensed the strain, and he, still navigating a world too complex for his age, learned that success could also isolate. These cracks, invisible to the millions who adored him, marked the beginning of an unraveling. They were the quiet signals of a life drifting away from balance, as the weight of fame, family pressure, and corporate expectation converged into a force no child could be expected to withstand. The collapse of Macaulay Culkin's childhood empire did not erupt in one catastrophic moment. It unfolded as a slow, inevitable breaking point, an erosion accelerated by the very forces that had elevated him. By the mid-1990s, he was no longer just Hollywood's most bankable child star. He had become a high-stakes negotiation tool in a battle driven largely by his father's escalating demands. Kit Culkin's confrontational approach, once interpreted as a protective stance, evolved into an obstacle that studios grew increasingly unwilling to navigate. Instead of collaborating with one of the industry's brightest young talents, producers found themselves entangled in tense standoffs that drained both time and resources. With each new project, the question quietly shifted from, "What can Macaulay bring to this film?" to, "Is the conflict worth it?" Behind the scenes, the turmoil at home deepened. Financial control became a battleground, with disputes over Macaulay's earnings and trust accounts creating fractures that would soon become irreparable. Legal documents were filed, negotiations turned hostile, and the family environment, already strained by years of pressure, shattered under the weight of competing priorities. For the first time, Macaulay's own voice entered the conversation, not through public statements, but through actions. He stopped taking roles, stepped away from sets, and resisted the relentless cycle that had defined nearly every year of his childhood. The media seized on his absence, crafting speculative narratives that framed him as unstable, rebellious, or ungrateful, reinforcing a myth the public quickly accepted. Few questioned why a child might want a life outside the spotlight. Fewer understood that stepping back was not an act of defiance, but an act of survival. The expectations placed upon him had reached a point no young person could reasonably endure, and the only choice left was to walk away from Hollywood, from the machinery built around him, and from the chaos that had consumed his family. When Macaulay finally disappeared from mainstream films, the public interpreted it as a fall from grace. But in truth, it was the first decision he made entirely for himself. It was a retreat from an industry that viewed him as a product, from a household fractured by control, and from a world that had taken his childhood and repackaged it for mass consumption. His collapse, as the world labeled it, was actually the beginning of something far more human. The quiet reclamation of a life that had never been allowed to belong to him. In the years that followed his departure from Hollywood, Macaulay Culkin did not step into a quiet life. He stepped into a vacuum shaped by misunderstanding, media distortion, and the lingering weight of a childhood lived under scrutiny. The world he left behind refused to let him go. Tabloids, eager to fill the silence he created, spun narratives that treated his absence as scandal rather than self-preservation. They framed him as a fallen prodigy, a symbol of wasted potential, a cautionary tale crafted more for entertainment value than truth. Meanwhile, the public, conditioned to view him only through the lens of Home Alone, struggled to reconcile the child they adored with the private adult he was becoming. Away from the cameras, Macaulay began confronting the emotional debris that years of exploitation and control had left behind. Legal conflicts surrounding his finances fractured his family further, carving deep rifts that time alone could not mend. The people who had once shaped his world drifted into roles defined by distance, unresolved tension, and unspoken regret. Without the constant structure of film sets or the noise of public adoration, he found himself navigating adulthood without the foundation most children are given, forced to rebuild an identity that had never been fully his in the first place. Yet amid this fragmentation, small moments of clarity emerged. He gravitated toward friendships that valued him not as an icon, but as a person. He explored music, independent creative projects, and unconventional roles that allowed him to express parts of himself long overshadowed by the myth of the child star. For the first time, he chose how and when to be seen. That autonomy, fragile at first, grew into a stabilizing force. Still, the shadow of his early fame loomed large. Every public appearance triggered waves of nostalgia and speculation, reminding him that the world remained more attached to the boy he once was than the man he had become. Yet he continued carving out spaces, untouched by that nostalgia. Rooms filled with laughter among close friends, quiet mornings without obligations, and decisions made without the weight of expectation. His aftermath was not a dramatic recovery arc, but a slow, deliberate process of redefining what it meant to live on his own terms. It was a reclamation shaped by resilience, the quiet endurance of someone who had been observed for too long, and the realization that stepping away from the world's gaze was the first act of true independence he had ever taken. With time and distance, Macaulay Culkin began reconstructing his life in ways that defied the narrative Hollywood once wrote for him. Instead of chasing a conventional comeback or attempting to revive the myth of his childhood stardom, he embraced a different path, one centered on autonomy, self-awareness, and a quiet confidence that came from finally owning his story. When he did choose to step back into the public eye, it was never as the prodigy audiences remembered, but as an adult who had survived a childhood shaped by forces far beyond his control. He leaned into humor, self-referential projects, and creative choices that allowed him to reclaim not just his image, but the meaning behind it. He found stability in relationships built on mutual respect rather than fame, surrounding himself with people who valued the individual beneath the legacy. His personal life softened into a space of calm, far removed from the pressures that once dictated every aspect of his existence. With partners and close friends, he rediscovered the quiet joys that childhood had deprived him of: privacy, companionship, and the freedom to exist without being observed. Each step forward became a subtle affirmation that his worth had never been tied to the box office numbers of his past, but to the person he continued to grow into. Professionally, he learned to engage with his past without being consumed by it. His self-aware performances and appearances, often tinged with wit and an undercurrent of truth, transformed the narrative surrounding him. Instead of being defined by what Hollywood had taken, he became a symbol of what someone can reclaim. His story no longer centered on the collapse of a child star, but on the resilience of a man who navigated extraordinary circumstances and emerged with a sense of clarity few expected him to find. In the end, Macaulay Culkin's journey stands as a reminder that not every life shaped by exploitation must remain tethered to it. Healing does not always look like triumph, and redemption does not always appear on a stage. Sometimes it is found in the quiet decision to step away, to rebuild, and to define success on one's own terms. His story is not the tragedy the world once assumed. It is a testament to endurance, transformation, and the profound power of reclaiming one's own narrative.